Welcome. This VPAL signature event is brought to you by Harvard's Office of the Vice Provost for Advances in Learning in collaboration with the 2021 HILT Conference. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. We'll be talking about connecting scholarship with action. Professors Paul Farmer and Arthur Kleinman share a passion for teaching students how to tackle real-world problems. In this follow-on event to HILT's 2021 annual conference, the faculty will discuss their respective pedagogical approaches. Paul will offer insights about how teaching and learning have responded to an international public health crisis, and Arthur will address how to use the practice of care to fight cynicism when it comes to addressing big problems. Paul and Arthur, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you for hosting us. This is becoming quite a tradition. I would also add, Jonathan, to your generous introduction, that this is fundamentally not a patient-doctor relationship, but a student-mentor relationship, and that my experience of and profession in anthropology has always been tied up with Arthur's. I'm just going to add this, as I did last year. When I was an undergraduate, and this was at Duke University in North Carolina, there was a course called medical anthropology, and I took it because I wanted to be a physician, and I would take anything with medical in it. Medical ethics, not a very good course, by the way. Anatomy of the lower extremity, you could take that at Duke. But I took medical ethics, and Arthur had just that year published his first book, which is called Patients and Healers in the Context of Culture. And I really did read that and know this is what I want to do. So I'm not sure until that moment that I would have put the epithet medical anthropologist on me, but after that I did. And and I also am telling this story because I know there are going to be undergraduates listening and grad students. And again, what we do for each other in this broader community of scholarship is what can lead us into action. So I came into this program, the MD PhD program that Arthur had started, and one of the few in the country already interested in action. And that's really how I came, not to medical anthropology in a classroom, but came to rediscover it as a practitioner. And don't forget, those listening from the anthropology side, that every physician is supposed to link scholarship to action. I mean, that's kind of the job description, but that's not true in all academic endeavors. And Arthur was acting as an activist in both his medical career and in his anthropology career. I remember one of the last paragraph of that book, which is not, I don't think, Arthur's favorite, but it's one that meant a lot to me, was he said at the end of it, "This is the message I would like to send echoing down the hallways of all of America's medical schools." And he may have said in China's as well, because he was writing from Taiwan at the time. And it moved me. It made me a campaigner in the sense of saying, I want to do that too. I want to send some messages down hallways in academic medical centers. I just didn't imagine back then that I would ever be fortunate enough to be a full-time professor. And that too, I'm grateful for Arthur for a lot of his steering over the years on that score. I know you weren't asking for, and Jonathan, I know that you're playing your role, but I know you weren't asking me to go into my early experience, meeting Arthur, but it's very much central to my entire career as an anthropologist. So Arthur, sorry to put you on the spot that way, but it's true.
Well, if you put me on the spot, I'll put you on the spot. That much of what I've learned from Paul. By your students, you'll be taught. We're colleagues, and we're here to talk about our teaching, and we teach together. One of the great joys of my life is having the experience every Tuesday and Thursday this fall of teaching a course with Paul, with Ann Becker, and with Salman Khashoggi. All of us are MD medical anthropologists. And the course is called Who Lives, Who Dies, Who Cares? And the central influence on this course, I think, has been Paul in two ways. One, that it is an attempt to look at how the very sources of illness and the way we respond to illness through institutions like the WHO, et cetera, have their roots historically in colonialism and in extraction of resources from poor societies, which are then used, in a sense, to be the place where they do good in the world. And I think what we've tried to do is, and Paul has led the way on this, is to problematize what is doing good in those places, and also to bring care to the way we teach. So I hope I'm not speaking out of, but let me just say that Paul is such a sympathetic, empathic individual that if he had his way, no student would get under an A, but not because the students had to manufacture A, but because we would work all the time, every day, to make those students outstanding students. And so we bring the idea of care to the very course we teach, even though we have 200 students in the course, and we have a bunch of graduate student teaching fellows. But we have these incredible discussions every Thursday morning about students who are in trouble or in difficulty to try to figure out how to help them. So the first thing I think that distinguishes our teaching is we don't see ourselves as gatekeepers. I think when I was a student at Stanford in the 1960s, I felt a lot of my teachers were gatekeepers and saw themselves that way, that there was a barrier or block to get on, and I had to get over it. And fortunately, I had the skills to get over it. We're doing just the reverse. We're opening up the doors. We're opening up the doors to students. We think every student can make it through here. We're going to help them to any degree we can. And when we test, the importance of the test is not that someone gets a grade, but that demonstrates to them and to us whether they understand what they're doing or not, and where we need to help them in ways. So I think that has been the most crucial commitment we've made to teaching, to make the very idea of care that we practice in our practices crucial to mentoring and teaching. And it's part of the department that Paul chairs, which is a department I chaired in the 1990s, and a department that I think has an extraordinary faculty that's linked together in an atmosphere oriented around care. Paul, what do you think?
Well, I think, I hope some people listening are pleasantly startled to know that, we take caregiving seriously as anthropologists, of course, as physicians, but also as teachers. Arthur brought up the whole term gatekeeper. One of the things that anthropology, it strikes me, has long done was to try, and I understand the checkered past of anthropology fairly well, but it's been trying to open the door or open the gate to other people. Now, again, I don't want to elevate the salvific role of anthropology or any other academic discipline. I'm saying this is what we should have been doing, is opening the gate. And that gate could be opening into material modernity in the sense not of some cultures or places having a corner market on material modernity, but just on the things that people identified as materially modern. For example, a roof, a home, access to an education, higher education, medical care. And so the gates that are closed to so many people, and I think this is revealed to many in the course of the so many pandemics, the COVID pandemic, is that we all need that kind of caregiving, and we all need those gates to be open. Some, on the other hand, need it to be open more than others. And anthropology, for me, has always been something of a tool to getting at, well, who needs what help most and when? And I doubt that most anthropologists see themselves in that triage kind of way, but that's been very helpful to me, to being able to draw on those skills of an anthropologist to figure out where a pandemic has come from, but also where it's going, or an epidemic. So again, these skills as an anthropologist can influence medical practice, of course, or actions of all course, especially when we consider the unanticipated consequences of social action. But we're also saying that they can inform our teaching and how we do it.
And the students who come to us are interested in engagement. They're already engaged. That's what makes the students so incredibly interesting to us. And as people, as we learn more about them, they have done things out in communities as brilliant high school students. They've come to Harvard and they want to get engaged. They want to work before COVID, we went out of our way to develop ladders for them so that they could begin one summer in Haiti or in Africa or in China, and another summer develop a research project, carry out their senior honors thesis on a subject of importance to both anthropology and global health, and then write it as a capstone experience in their senior year. And we usually get for this big course we teach in the fall each year, we usually get about a third of the course is our first year students. So we've had the chance to work with students over the years. And I think that's been just wonderful. And
a number of them, I would add, Arthur, a number of our students have gone on to medical school, of course, some with us, but many others, including our teaching fellows, have elaborated or gone into careers that also draw on this global health work. Some of them are still teaching with us to this day.
Absolutely, yeah. So, no, is that a teaching philosophy? I really think it is a teaching philosophy. And I would, remember that Aristotle said, bravery comes from the habit of acting brave. Temperance from the habit of acting temperate. And I think that what we try to do is to show that we've developed the habit of acting as caregivers, and we try to demonstrate that, model it in the work that we do and in the teaching that we do, with the expectation that our students will model it for themselves. We'll bring it on as something that they're going to be and do. And we have the most, I think, fabulous connection to former students over a long period of time. And so this really works.
Well, as proof of that, 4 people teach this course, and it's Arthur and 3 of his students, and I mean PhD level students. So there's I think a lot of the students can see us working and teaching together and being together and understand that we take seriously our social obligations to each other as well.
Do we have questions or?
Sure, let's jump in with those questions now. We're starting to receive them now, and please, everyone, use the Q&A function. But let's start off with one that's already been sent. Traditionally, academia is the place of, well, I hate to say the ivory tower, but the removal from the real world. So what would you say to people who think that action undermines the neutrality of academia? Paul, let me start with you.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. In the social sciences, including anthropology, there is at this point not a lot of conviction that scholarship is neutral. And I think this is true in many other disciplines as well. Even in the basic sciences, there are significant debates about this. So to the questioner, I would say I didn't go into medical school or graduate school in anthropology believing that there was such a thing as neutrality. And it was better to take a hermeneutic or a heuristic of one sort or another. Examples, of course, would be when we talk about a gender equity lens. When is that a bad idea to try and reflect on something with a gender lens? How about a lens focused on racism versus anti-racism? Again, a useful thing to do. and even in some of the basic sciences, as I said. So we have had less of a struggle with that, I think, back to the question, because we are also representing anthropology where these struggles have been dealt with in the earlier part of the last century. I say dealt with, I don't mean definitively, I just meant this has been front and center in anthropology for a long time. Arthur?
Well, I think the very active engagement is a method of understanding and knowledge production. And I think that's what, our students are recognizing the work that we do, that we have been trained in, believe in, and convey to them a critical understanding, a deep critical understanding of society, of human experience, of health and disease. But that critical understanding is not simply meant to be there as some very sophisticated set of understandings remote from action. Rather, it takes on its significance in actions, in caregiving, in Paul's terms, in accompaniment activities, which he has so magnificently demonstrated in poor societies. In my own work in Chinese society, I work in China, and I've got a big project now at a time in which the relations between the United States and China, even with the good conversation that Biden and Xi had the other night, are not so good. And it reminds me very much of the Soviet Union era and the importance of academic connections across things. And I have dozens of former students in China who I have very close connections with. And again, the focus is on action. Evidence for action. It's not that we're uncritical about evidence. We're very critical about evidence. But we take evidence as the basis for knowledge in practice. And I don't think by any means are we particularly innovative in that regard. I think there's a widespread idea about this. And I think the great originator, in a way, at Harvard in this is William James. So William James, 100 years ago, actually 110 years ago, said that all knowledge comes from experience. And the purpose of knowledge is to go back to experience, to improve people's lives, to reform society. And I think it's that part of anthropology that we're very interested in. If you look at anthropology, sociology, the other social sciences, there have been periods of time when they have been so mystified and attracted to scientizing and becoming most objective as they can be, that they've forgotten the originating purpose. You go back to The Wealth of Nations, or Max Weber's work, or Hannah Arendt, or any of the social theorists who said the purpose of theory and the purpose of research is to do something about people's lives, help them, and improve society. Okay, and yet all the academic fields have tensions between that being seen as "quote unquote" applied and therefore not high level enough. And we take a different perspective. We believe that history and theory are very critical to evidence-based work, but that evidence-based work has to lead to practice.
That's good. So you're addressing neutrality in two senses then. So there's neutrality meaning apolitical and neutrality meaning inactive or lack of action. Let's get at both of those. I'm going to start with the first one, and I'll take to Paul. Think about the ethics of international relief work, given imperialism, colonialism, history in much of the developing world. So how do you address the ethics there in your work, and how do you recommend that to students?
Well, the primary ethics there are the ethics of redress, I would argue. I mean, I don't think that's original. So, for example, in the context of colonial rule, let me just get to specifics, Jonathan. In Rwanda, where I've worked a long time, one of the startling things to do is to go back over the historical record. As Arthur said, everybody's got a history, everybody's got context, but it's actually hard to point to failed medical endeavors under colonial rule, but in large part because there were so few of them to fail on the continent of Africa. And again, I don't know other continents as well, even my own. But I think, when you talk about the ethics of global health, the first point should be, where is it? Why don't people have access to it? Where are all these medical services that we hear about and read about, but so rarely see? So I think right now it's okay. And, we've had a lot of discussions about this in our class. It's okay to underline the ethics of access, meaning we have to have some basic services to provide to people before we can determine whether or not they're good or bad. They're just been absent. And again, I'm exaggerating, but only a little bit for effect. So the ethical questions that we hear in American universities about neutrality in observation are not at all related to the ethical critiques that we hear if we're working, in a squatter settlement or a slum or a refugee camp. I mean, I've never heard those kind of questions at all. It's really been the ones that Arthur underlined, like, how could you do more for us because we're in great need? And so I'm just saying that I don't find those critiques of, intervening as somehow morally perilous. They're not as morally perilous as colonial rule. And, they have risks like all other active interventions. But they're not as dangerous as inaction.
Yeah.
Now, that's my own view. Others dispute it, even in our class. Not so much the faculty. Again, all physician anthropologists sworn to action. But, sometimes we do hear critiques. They just don't tend to come from quarters where medical and education needs have not been addressed. Sorry. In other words, these are the critiques we hear in affluent settings. Not so much, in my experience, in the places where I see patients.
I mean,
Arthur, please pick up. Yes.
Yeah, I want to add to that. So we have a fundamental anthropological critique of ethics. We think that ethics, the way it's developed, especially health and medical ethics, bioethics, has failed to recognize the uneven playing field that is the beginning of health and social disparities. And our approach to ethics is you can't raise ethical questions until you begin with that fundamental ethical beginning, that it is an uneven playing field, a disadvantaged playing field. And until you argue to make that, to increase the advantage for those who are marginal, deeply impoverished, and at greatest risk for disease, until you begin that, you really can't talk about ethics. And the same thing we do when ethics comes to personal experience. We want to emphasize moral development, moral challenges, moral conflicts. Those are not necessarily just the abstracted ethical principles, which are wonderful principles, social justice, etc. But they are the conflicts we feel when we're in a setting in which the values of the world we're in, that local world, are different than the values we have inside ourselves. And what do you do in that setting? And that is the problem that practitioners routinely experience. Okay, so you look at our healthcare system, a broken, chaotic healthcare system. You have fantastic doctors with great commitments at work in this system, trying to figure out how to give quality care under the worst of circumstances in which our hospitals say they're nonprofit, but are caught up in a for-profit world, okay? In which the idea, in some sense, is that the patient is a profit center, not just for the pharmaceutical industry, not just for other businesses, but literally for the way we've organized our healthcare system. So those are, for us, those are what make care so important. if you take the view of health and of society from the perspective of care, then you raise the questions that Paul raises so eloquently. They become the central questions.
So picking up on this, Arthur, I start with you. It's a nice question here about, okay, you're giving students education, then you're putting them in these projects. Do the projects really give them deep intellectual engagement, or is it just so narrow and so specific that they're not really able to extrapolate?
Yeah, first of all, that's a great question. I want to thank whoever asked that question. So I headed for 8 years Harvard's Asia Center, and I'm a China scholar amongst other things. I'm deeply committed to the idea of the very deep understanding of a context. A societal context, a community context. And I think what Paul has demonstrated in his work, and what the rest of us have tried to work at, is how you use that understanding, that deep understanding, to understand why so many well-intentioned health interventions fail. Why do they fail? I would say, actually, in my field, in global mental health, most interventions fail. Why have they failed? There are some wonderful examples of successes, and we happen to have, as our colleague Vikram Patel, who's one of the great exemplars of success in global mental health. But why do so many projects fail? Because there has been inadequate understanding of the context, especially of the historical basis of that context. So I don't think this is a dichotomy at all. And indeed, I would say that area studies, which is under such threat today, the idea of a deep understanding of society, is enlivened and in a sense advanced by the idea of engagement, of using that knowledge to be engaged.
That's fair, but I'm going to bounce this to Paul for a second. One could just as easily make the argument, because you need that context, because you need the deep understanding, therefore a project limited to a semester has to be a toy problem. You can't really get so rich beyond it. So, Paul, prove me wrong.
No, I can't prove you wrong, Jonathan. I would just say that what kind of mentor would put a student into, a position after telling him or her, oh, this is all about you. You're going to do this project soup to nuts during the course of the semester. Now, the answer to the rhetorical question, what kind of mentor would do that? The answer is all too often most mentors. But that's not how we're proceeding. We're trying to tell students, don't exaggerate your own personal efficacy.
Right.
2 months, your goal here is to fit in, to be part of something larger. They get this message, Jonathan, all the time. You're great. You're, most wonderful young people we've ever met, which in my experience at Harvard is pretty much true. But we're not going to be saying, hey, you need cultural competence and historical knowledge to do this. We're saying what you really need is cultural humility and the knowledge that you need the knowledge. Because, if you can arm students with those two things, even just those two things, a quest for cultural humility rather than a cultural competence, which is how anthropology gets distorted, by the way. I can't remember any anthropologist saying to me, well, you should, certainly not Arthur when he was supervising my thesis, you need to be completely competent in every aspect of Haitian culture. He never said that to me. And we don't say it to our students. We say, wouldn't it be great to be part of something bigger? Would you like to see how global health is done, on the ground, whether that's in some place in the United States or in Peru or anywhere else? And, we spent some time saying, you got to check your own privilege in order to be a full functioning, even temporary member of a team like this. So I think I cannot disprove what you said, Jonathan. I share your doubts, in fact. And that's why we try to do our mentoring a little bit differently. And when we're lucky, we get to do it, as Arthur said, over many years. I mean, we stay in touch with a lot of our students, I think, probably even compared to other, faculty members.
This is really helpful because there are many who are in our audience who are either taking or potentially even leading courses that are it's kind of experiential and action learning. And so one key role is, what is the role of the mentor more than just, assigning students to each other and making sure they don't fight? But another is, how do you select the projects? What's the, in a world, this is to a question that's asked here, in a world in which there are such big problems, whether it be big pandemics or giant humanitarian crises that have been lasting for generations, how do you size the project to both the course and the context? Paul, maybe I'll start with you and then allow Arthur respond.
I would love to say something, Jonathan. Thank you. When Arthur, give me a couple extra minutes here. When I was a medical student, I started in 1984, and I benefited in that first year from research funding for Harvard medical students. And by the way, my colleague who teaches the course we're teaching now, Ann Becker, she got funds from the same source at the same time. What Harvard Medical School asked us to do to get that money was to write up a full-blown hypothesis-driven project, summer project, that could be launched and finished in the course of a summer. Now, again, anthropologists would say, well, what kind of social fiction is that? Why were they telling their students to do that? That's not empirically possible, really, right? And the answer comes again from this whole realm of the sociology of knowledge, of how scientific and other social problems are elaborated and put before students, but also faculty members. So that's in looking back now at how would we do things differently, it's good if we know the past history as well. So you ask the pragmatic question though, how do we identify? Well, we let the students do that a lot themselves. Like they'll come in and they'll say, I'm really interested in, and then they'll name a place. And that place will almost, not invariably, but very often have something to do with them or their lives. It's maybe their parents came from that place. Maybe they were born there. Maybe they go back and forth. So we do try to say then, okay, well, why beyond that do you want to work there? And often they'll have very good reasons. But sometimes we'll say, well, why don't you go to Peru instead, or Rwanda, or so it's an ongoing process. We also have a number of teaching faculty, fellows, they're called now, or still, who have a good deal of experience placing students in, matching them up with some interest. Again, it could be in a place, it could be in a problem, diagnostics, a disease, maybe their, grandmother had dementia, maybe a distant acquaintance had leukemia. Whatever their reasons for this are, we don't disparage them. We just ask them to deepen their own understanding of why they're interested in that. And then we have a group of people, again, they're teaching fellows who we work with and say, well, what about this for this person? And of course, students also come in with their own resources, not only their own experience, as Arthur mentioned, but their own resources. They have connections, they know people, they have hometowns, all of them. So it's a ad hoc process, Jonathan, but it's not one we are trivial about. Although we do say to them sometimes, usually sub rosa, no matter what comes out of this summer, it's going to be something good. Like maybe they won't get done the project they had hoped to, but that's part of the process of discovery. Every anthropologist actually learns about this before going into the field, about how their design projects will likely fail. I mean, we actually tell our students things like that in anthropology. So, it's a congenial mode for us. And Arthur, I'll turn it over to you, but it's not one that we do without, discussions with the students about what it is that they want to do.
Yeah. My experience has been that students come in often with ideas about what they want to do. And the first thing you have to say is, now you want to go do that in your grandparents' hometown in central China. Do you know if the people there really want that done? Is that what they regard as their concern, as their real concern? I've sent hundreds of Harvard undergraduates to Chinese society, Taiwan, China, Hong Kong, many different places. And I think the first learning experience is having them come up with an understanding of a local world. I think that's one of anthropology's great commitments, that there's always a view from somewhere. There's no view from nowhere. Nowhere does not give you a view. And having that understanding of a local world then allows you to work with students to have them develop projects. And those projects, as Paul said, the first time they do that, they go there, they may not get anywhere, but they've made some starts and they made some connections and their ideas develop. And then if they're serious about it, they're going to return. And they're going to return with better ideas, with a deeper sense of what's at stake for people and how they can contribute to that. And they're going to both be transformed by that experience and have an experience that transforms others. And that builds on our own work. So you're very familiar, I think, Jonathan, with Paul's work. Let me just tell you something about myself. I introduced the modern idea of depression into China. And I was incredibly delighted with it, that I had this effect. I did this in the late 1970s and the early 80s, only to find that the pharmaceutical industries in China decided that my work was a great way to sell drugs, to sell medicines, most of which were unneeded or inappropriately needed. Because 50% of depressions are mild, don't require any medical intervention of any sort, psychotherapeutic or somatic. But the drug companies used my findings to sell drugs. The result of it was that I recognized, and now, I try to teach this to my students, look at the unintended consequences of your work. Yeah. Look at how the relatively limited interventions, space of interventions that we have, can be rolled over and taken in a different direction by forces beyond us, and understand those forces. And I'll give you one other example. At the time when Paul was in a medical school, I introduced 8 questions to doctors that I thought would make the doctor-patient relationship much more human. Those questions were taught at half of America's medical schools. But I discovered, and this is exactly what my students have discovered, how easily, with the best of intentions, your interventions can be misplaced. And so I meant these 8 questions as a psychiatrist, after all, thinking about chronic illness generally, heart disease, cancer, diabetes, of improving the communication between doctors and patients. But I would go to places as a visiting professor or be invited to medical schools, many American medical schools. And the residents and students wanted to please me, and they would say, "Oh, Dr. Kleinman, we use your questions. Now look at the charts here we have. We have the blood pressure, we have the electrolytes, we have the oxygen, the blood oxygen level, and we have your question, the answer to your questions." And I said, "No, that's not where they were supposed to be fixed in amber. They were meant to start a conversation, but they were used to end the conversation, suggesting that there was something much bigger that anyone interested in humanizing medicine had to take on, a deep cultural understanding of what it is in medicine that allows political economy of businesses and politics of government to subvert, undermine, and redraw the attempts of practitioners to do good for their patients. And I think when a student learns those things, an equivalent to that, not necessarily the same thing, through the work of Paul or Salman Khashoggi or Ann Becker or myself or others of our, Gene Richardson and many, many others, they have learned something extraordinarily important. They don't just go after that, I think, into interventions without asking questions, deep critical questions. But I think if you'll just give me a minute, Paul, on this one.
Yeah, sure.
I think that what we try to do is something that Henry James, I think, most effectively conveyed the idea about. In a short story of his called The Middle Years in the Aspern Papers, Henry James has an elderly doctor who's dying and being treated, an elderly writer who's dying and being treated by a young doctor. And the young doctor has a secret which the old doctor intuits. The young doctor wants to be a great writer, like this great writer who's dying of heart disease. And at the end of his life, the great writer tries to convey to the doctor something important about writing and about medicine. And he says, we work in the dark. We do what we can. We give what we have. Our passion is our doubt, but passion is our task. I think that's incredibly important for our students. Our passion is our doubt because our critical mindedness is crucial. Evidence, critical mindedness, that is crucial for understanding things. But leaving out the passion, not allowing the passion to lead to something like intervention, okay, or witnessing, leaving that out is for Henry James, was wrong, was simply wrong. And I think that's where we are, that our passion is to take that knowledge and show kids how you can use it in the world. And even if the interventions fail, you can be transformed by them, and so can others.
I want to pick up on several things I'm hearing about, because these are characteristics both of applied learning and arguably of care and working in the field. So we talked about humility. We've talked about context. We've talked about agency and the element of passion in this agency of choosing something that is important to you. We talked about consequences, intended and unintended. Let's talk a little more about values as well. To what extent you either are teaching values directly or helping students reflect on their own values, whether it be by choosing projects, working through projects, discovering things to fail, et cetera. Paul, let me start with you. What's the role of individual values or perhaps societal values in the action learning and experiential learning you teach?
Well, Arthur has written as much about this as anyone and lived it. We do get sometimes flummoxed a bit because we're using a word that has been commandeered by the right wing, and I mean moral. So local moral worlds, an insight. Arthur and the late Joan Kleinman wrote a great deal about this very compellingly, and also I think inspiringly, saying, you can learn about a local moral world too. All you need is enough cultural humility and industriousness and a willingness to look, right? But when we say, when we talk about local moral worlds or about values, sometimes we do end up in not at loggerheads, but obviously the words have different meanings. But I would say we plow through that and make this largely a course about making moral meaning in the world. Yes, there are a lot of details. We also try to encourage the students not to worry about all the details if they can look them up. I mean, this is very much in keeping with current pedagogical trends. But really to focus on some of those sentiments that Arthur mentioned. Like, if you feel passion, which most of them do in our experience, then any attempt to lessen that passion or to move it outside of a university, we get to object to that. We get to say to them, no, we think if you're going to be in a university, which you are now, and some will remain in one way or another, you might want to continue, consider tapping into these moral values that you're reading about. One other thing that I would just say, and then turn it over to Arthur, is in years past, he would often say, don't forget these students, and they are mostly kids. Not in a sense of all adults, but some of them have come. If a third of our students are freshmen, they're right out of their own households, but they bring in a lot of passion. And one thing Arthur used to say every year at the beginning was, don't forget they're trying on new vocabularies. So part of what we should be doing is helping them struggle with the concepts, not just master them, struggle with them like we do. And I love that part of the class. It's really the first third. Sometimes we'll have people saying, well, why aren't we going to talk about specific intervention projects and why they've failed or succeeded? But we spend the first third of our class going over, these big ideas, including social theories related to global health, including the history of colonial rule, including a number, including where we are now in this neoliberal moment where we're all struggling to find out, well, what is beyond commodity? What is a right? So I think the good thing about this approach, which sounds sort of experimental, is that we get to struggle with it every fall. And we learn for our other classes as well, because this is a class where we have the most infrastructure for struggle, right? We have 10 teaching fellows. We get to meet every week. We wrote the textbook. We're experienced teaching the course. So we get to spend more of our time on this struggle, including the one Arthur mentioned, between passion and reason.
What Paul was referring to about the way we teach values is, from an anthropological standpoint, the moral is not necessarily good. Think of the moral as what's at stake for people in a group. Yeah. What's at stake at times can be terrible. Okay, you can see a big sign over a clinic that says "Serve the people," but when you go in, you discover that they're serving themselves, because moral experience, moral life is in the body. It's embodied. It's in actions. It's embedded in our interpersonal relations and our social roles. And sometimes what you're embedded in is not good. And I think the great thing with the way we try to teach it is that by reflecting on this, you can understand that your own desire for doing something that's good and useful may conflict with your world. And then what do? And so this is the way that we teach values. You extend beyond the moral, which is about the local, looking for ethical support. And sometimes you find great ethical support, such in ideas of social justice, for example. But also that ethical support is not just coming out of the blue. It's been written up by men and women, principally men. It's been developed in the context that is the context that's created the world that we live in today. And it has its own biases, limitations, and problems. So that aspiration for the ethical, for doing the right thing, is faced with all kinds of difficulties. And I think that we try to tell that story through the cases that we show. We look at cases, we take for granted, for example, that Médecins Sans Frontières is a great organization doing great things, and they have done great things. Okay. But Médecins Sans Frontières also has participated in worlds in which some of the things they did were not so good. Public health generally has what makes, I think, Paul Farmer such a remarkable icon of health is that it comes out of the social medicine that we all participate in and believe in, where prevention is balanced by care. Okay. A lot of public health experts say to us, oh, come on, you're resource insensitive. You're expecting us to do good things in a world where they don't have resources. People in poor countries can't get the same care that we have in the United States. They don't have the same resources. Well, I'll shift to you now to carry the argument forward.
Well, the idea that we could live in a world that's so ahistorical, where you wouldn't, add right after that, yeah, they don't have resources because we took them away, where the idea that would be considered a polemic comment as opposed to historical fact is a challenge in our work, So, by the way, the story Arthur just mentioned in passing is a real story where actually a classmate of mine from the MD PhD program, who did not go into anthropology as his chosen field beyond medicine, wrote about all of us, very critically. I got to admit, Arthur, I still haven't read it, but, saying that we were resource insensitive. Obviously, that would be funny if it weren't, if we didn't think about how much time we have to think about finding the resources necessary to address some of these health problems. So, and back to your original question, Jonathan, we also spend a lot of our time doing that, trying to find the resources that could put some impelling action behind our scholarship. Obviously that's what Partners in Health does. Partners Health is not a small concern. It's 20,000 people running 250 hospitals in the world, right? But to do that, you have to work with other people. You have to be part of something beyond the typical academic unit of oneself.
Well, this is very helpful. Recognizing the resource constraints of time, which we need to finish in just 2 minutes, but also I'll give you both a hypothetical to end with. It's a very nice question that comes up. Imagine you're king, or even better, dean for a day, and you could incorporate one lecture on anthropology into the required curriculum for every first-year medical resident at HMS. One lecture on anthropology. Arthur, what's the topic? And then I'll turn to Paul.
I'd say it's the anthropology of moral experience.
Say more.
It's the anthropology that raises questions about what is the good? What is meaning? We live in a society that prides itself on raising very tough questions and difficult questions and engaging them. Our society has never debated what Chinese society debated 20 years ago. They debated what is a good life? What is an adequate life? From the standpoint of government and from the standpoint of communities, standpoint of individuals. We've never taken that question on. We can't take it on, really, because it would expose the sharp discrepancy between our values stated and our values practiced in our society.
Very good. Paul, over to you.
Well, I was going to answer with a course that I took, but I actually agree with Arthur. I got a lot out of Introduction to Social Theory, and Arthur, I took that with Nur Yalman, a very distinguished Turkish anthropologist who's emeritus in the department. But I really want to go back to the anthropology of lived experience and moral connection, as Arthur did. Because it seems to me, if you were to design a class like that, and we have designed some, and we, Arthur, too, you can get at cultural humility. You can get at the need to understand social context and social history, or just the need to understand that you don't know it. So I think if I look back over the last 30 years as a medical professor, pretty close. I think some of those years ran right by me, when others were saying, well, let's teach cultural competence. We should have been saying, no, that's not the course the med students need. They need a course in cultural humility and how to piece together the information they need to know enough about their patients to do a good job as a clinician, but also a good job as a person, as a caregiving person. And I think we could and should design classes like that for every first-year med student and nursing student.
If I could just add to that, I wrote this book, The Soul of Care, based on 10 years of taking care of my late wife for her early onset Alzheimer's disease. And what I took to be the essence of the difficult experience I had personally was that you had to come to terms with what really mattered for you in your life. That requires a kind of education we don't pay attention to today at the university. That's the moral development of students. It's not their learning about ethics, it's their own personal moral development. And I believe that in Who Lives, Who Dies, Who Cares, the course we've been talking about, we try to model moral development.
Very good. This has been very powerful. I thank you, Arthur and Paul. And thanks to all of you who have joined us today.
I just want to say your moderation and questions were just superb. So thank you.
It's very kind of you to say. I'm merely an amanuensis for those who've contributed to the Q&A, as I hope they'll do in future events. Hope you'll join us for more signature events soon. Information on upcoming events, as well as recordings of past ones, can be found at vpal.harvard.edu/vpal-events. Good night, everyone, and thank you for making this event part of your lived experience. Take care, everyone.